Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the growth of the Catholic Church during the High Middle Ages, right? So we left off in class talking about the growth of monasteries and convents, and we talked about the growth of Gothic architecture, and we looked at some really, really pretty buildings and stuff like that, like this bad boy up here known as Westminster Abbey, right? Talked about all these different kind of architectural schemes that are coming into the Gothic Church, and then, not into the Gothic Church, into the Catholic Church, who had Gothic architecture, right? And we also began to talk about as well the growth of monasteries and convents, and basically what this entire last series of flips has been about is basically the growth of the Catholic Church and its power during the Middle Ages, right? We discussed a lot of different things, right? And the big thing that we actually left off in class talking about is the growth of the Catholic Church in terms of educational value. We started talking about how monasteries and convents will eventually grow and flower themselves into universities. And a big thing we talked about as well is that the monks and nuns that lived there were basically the people in charge of actually growing all of this intelligence, right? They took vows of labor and silence and writing, and tons of monks would spend all day long just sitting there copying texts one from another, of early doctors of the church and early things like that. And I think it was Darcy in class was just like, yeah, they're doing it so they can understand the faith better, right? And that is exactly right. That is the essence of study, right? In the image of St. Thomas Aquinas, actually understanding and growing your knowledge so you can better understand your faith, right? So going into it though as well, we left off in class also talking about how this is going to lead to the loss of a lot of Roman writings because they actually had to recycle a lot of the old parchment. Because remember, it's still the Middle Ages. And it's still the Middle Ages in the sense that they're not really making tons of new product, right? And actually paper making is a process that actually they're not even going to really relearn in Europe until the Muslims actually begin to show it to them following the Crusades, which we'll be talking about in our next class, right? But going into it as well, what do y'all think is this going to do to the price of books, right? If monks are having to copy these things by hand and they're all going to be hand decorated and like literally have hand like drawn images on the inside of them and they look like this, what do you think is going to do to the price of books? It's going to send it sky high, right? Something that you need to understand is that this method of creating books, of copying them one at a time, is going to make books extremely expensive, right? And that the monks and nuns are the ones that are actually basically just a small percentage of people in Europe that can actually read and write at this time, okay? So it's going to make books very, very inaccessible, and it's going to keep that literacy rate pretty stifled, right? Now, one other thing that we need to talk about as well when it talks about the growth of monasteries and convents is the growth of this thing known as Benedictine rule, right? Now, Benedictine rule isn't going to be super important. Well, it's important in the Middle Ages, but it's going to be really important later on when we get close to the Reformation as well, okay? So the Benedictine rule, or Saint Benedict himself, created a series of rules that all monks and nuns were supposed to live their lives by, right? So as we talked about, these guys that are taking vows of labor, and these different monks that are taking vows of labor and silence, these different monks that are taking vows of writing, the thing that you need to understand is that Benedict wanted to create a series of laws, and he does this around the 6th century BC, which is in the 500s AD, he does this around the 6th century AD, which is about the 500s AD, which is of course going to be in the early Middle Ages, and some of you are like, I'm so confused, why do you keep jumping back and forth? Because y'all, it's history, it's Western civilization, so you got to jump back and forth a little bit, right? So Saint Benedict is going to create these rules. And these rules are actually going to basically govern monastic life and things they can and can't do. For example, it's going to regulate the vows of silence. It's going to tell them how long they're supposed to do things, what things they're supposed to eat, how long they're supposed to fast, right? There's another little random Benedictine rule that says that they can't eat cloven-hooved animals. And there's another random Benedictine rule that says that they have to sleep with a nightlight on at all times. They can never sleep completely in the dark. And they also have to sleep in their like monk garb or nun garb so they can jump up and go and preach at like any moment, right? So like now, going into it though as well though, the three that are getting added later, much later, are actually going to be vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty, which are going to help outline the structure of the priesthood and the Catholic Church. Now the thing about it is when we look at the poverty concept, later on going towards the Reformation, the church is going to become fabulously wealthy. Looking at the chastity concept, we saw a lot of priests or some priests and popes having like illegitimate kids going into the Reformation. And speaking of the obedience thing, we saw some popes take advantage of that obedience power and were really usurping the power of the church for themselves, right? So that's a big thing to kind of just keep in the back of your mind, that the St. Benedictine rules are really important for regulating the early monastic church and the early monastic orders, but also later on they kind of tend to get violated and it gets a little bit weird, right? So going into it though as well, the church is going to begin to grow politically speaking, okay? The church is going to grow very strong politically because popes are actually, during the High Middle Ages, going to begin to compete with kings and governments for power, okay? They're literally going to try and exert their authority over kings and other governments. And what this is considered, or what it's known as, is called papal supremacy, right? So when popes begin to compete with kings and governments for power, this is what's known as papal supremacy. Papal supremacy or papal suprematic power is basically this in essence, that the Pope believed that he was stronger and actually able to exert his power over kings and governments by threatening them with faith-based punishments, right? So, and this is some popes, not all. It's very, very rare that this would happen and stuff like that. It actually only happened like a handful of times, but still at the exact same time, the papacy was growing to be a political power. And also, speaking of it being a political power, it even actually owned basically its own country. There was this little like area in the middle of Italy known as the Papal States, and actually Rome was the main city within the Papal States. And the Papal States also were very well known for being extremely political, waging wars, growing territory, things like that, right? So the thing about it though is these popes basically saying, I have more power than you, king. I am the one who can talk to God, king. I am the one who can do whatever I want. So do what I say and go along with what I'm doing, or else, right? And one really, really great example of this is this concept is this feud that happened between Henry IV, one of the Holy Roman Emperors, and this guy named Gregory VII, right? So Gregory VII was the Pope. He's sitting right here in his chair. And that right there is Henry IV, right? A king dressed in a hair shirt, embarrassingly pleading for the Pope to take him back, right? Because what had happened is Gregory VII got really, really mad at Henry IV because Henry IV wanted to appoint his own bishops, right? Gregory VII was like, stop doing that, or I'm going to excommunicate you. And of course, he actually does. And Henry IV, to try and get back into the church, has to wear a hair shirt and embarrass himself. So this is an interesting element of punishments that are issued by the church during this time period. What, of course, happened to Henry IV right there was a famous one known as excommunication, right? Excommunication is when you're literally kicked out of the church, right? You're kicked out of the church, you don't receive the sacraments, you can't receive a holy matrimony, you can't receive a proper burial, you can't do any of those things, and in essence, if you're excommunicated, the medieval community believed that you were destined for hell, right? Now, another interesting thing about it as well is that there's another one, it's called an interdiction, right? Excommunication is pretty simple, you're just kicked out of the church, right? Interdictions, on the other hand, are when a pope would actually have an excommunication, but for an entire plot of land or an entire country. And this was usually used to actually punish a noble or a lord or something like that. 9 times out of 10 to kind of inspire a revolt or actually inspire dramatic change. We're actually going to see this happen in England. There's this guy later on in a couple of flips we'll talk about named King John, who's absolutely terrible and was actually interdicted by the Pope at the time. I think it was Innocent III that did that to him, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is Pope John receives an interdiction and the barons rise up against him. It's one of the reasons why it ends up going off and signing the Magna Carta. Now, the thing going into it, though, also, is we need to understand that there are some pretty extreme punishments. So excommunication, you're kicked out. Interdiction, if I'm a powerful lord or noble, not only am I kicked out, but all the people that live on my land are, right? They might revolt against me. Now, extreme punishments, though, include the Inquisition and torture, right? That's right, there was torture going on in the Middle Ages. What the Inquisition is, though, in general, is this thing known as a special church court, right? Now, a court, what I mean by having judges, no jury, but like judges, and you're being accused of a crime, right? So an Inquisition was basically a court that tried and convicted suspected heretics, right? Heretics are people that are going against the church, going against the faith, and rebelling against the faith in general, okay? And so the thing about it is that's going against anybody who speaks out or speaks down on the church, okay? So the Inquisition would bring you in, accuse you of your crime, allow you to repent and stuff like that, and if you refuse to do so and refuse to confess, you would sometimes be tortured, right? This guy right here is a very, very famous scientist who actually stood in front of one of the Inquisitions. He is none other than Galileo, right? Galileo, of course, the scientist who tried to prove that actually the Earth went around the sun, not the other way around, was accused of being a heretic because it was actually a very politically tumultuous time during the 30 Years' War when he was doing all these things. And this right here is his Inquisition. This panel of priests are saying, did you say this? Did you do this? And they threatened him with torture and burning at the stake. And so Galileo actually said that, oh, I was just kidding, I didn't mean it. And he ends up under house arrest for a pretty good while. Now, another handful of things that you would very well much want to know is how they actually tortured people, right? This is one famous one, it's known as the rack. It's when they would actually stretch your body out and stuff like that and try to force you to confess. This one right here is known as the strapata, or the pulley, where they would actually lift the victim up off the ground and then drop you back down on the ground, all while saying Hail Marys or certain prayers in between. And then another famous one is known as Catholic water torture, aka what is now known as waterboarding, all right? So now going into it, though, as well, that right there is where we're going to kind of go and kind of cut off the Catholic Church, right? We're going to kind of like end the Catholic Church stuff, and now we're going to start talking about something else. We're going to start talking about emerging kingdoms, right? So what we're seeing now also happen during the High Middle Ages, starting in the early Middle Ages and then transposing itself into the High Middle Ages, is the growth of emerging kingdoms, right? You're seeing literally some places pop up that you now actually would call modern-day countries, right? That actually started out as large-based kingdoms, all right? So the thing about it was we're going to talk about the story of England. You can talk all kinds of stuff like this. You can talk about Philippe in France beating King John for more land holdings in France. You can talk about like the Holy Roman Empire being an emerging kingdom leading eventually to Germany. But we're going to talk about England because England's my favorite one to talk about, and also England's the one that makes the most sense, right? So now going into it though, what you need to understand is England from about 400 to 900, okay, as an emerging kingdom, it wasn't like England is now. One unanimous area with a culture all its own and a place that had a capital city and a government and all this other stuff. From 400 to 900, from right about the end of the fall of Rome to about 900 AD, it was controlled by a handful of different groups. There were different barbarian tribes that actually lived on the Isle of Britain, right? And they were known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Danes, right? Now, the Danes is another fancy word for the Vikings, right? The Vikings actually took over all that area in pink right there. It was a period of time known as the Danelaw, right? Now, the Angles and Saxons, though, were actually all down here in brown and stuff like that. And at one point, the Danelaw actually expanded until the fact that only this little teeny little chunk right over there actually belonged to the Angles and the Saxons, right? But the thing about it is I'm actually watching this show right now. It's known as The Last Kingdom. It's very, very good. It actually has a character in it known as Alfred, or King Alfred. And King Alfred was a very real person in real life. All right? And he actually is the king that is going to get fed up with these pesky Vikings, right? These Vikings that have come in and taken over different areas like close to Northumbria and taken over the mainland areas that now actually involve Londinium and London and all these other different parts of like England. And he's going to come in and he's going to be like, no. And he unites the Angles and Saxons together, and he's basically the English version of Clovis, right? We talked about this of like the emerging kingdoms as well in the early Middle Ages with the Frankish kingdom under Clovis. Well, Alfred the Great comes along, and he unites the nobles and the lands underneath him, and he actually gets rid of all these things known as petty kingdoms, right? Petty kingdoms were really, really small, and like actually interesting little thing about it in the early Middle Ages from about like 400 to 900. There were tons of kings in England, like lots and lots of them. But when you think of England or a country or kingdom, you think of one king and a huge amount of land, right? Well, in the early Middle Ages, there were tons of little small ones. What Alfred's going to do is actually force all these other kings to actually answer to him as the supreme leader of all their people, and he leads a massive set of like actual battles to stop Viking invasions, right? And the three biggest effects that Alfred the Great has is he basically creates the idea that would one day become England, right? That's why it's actually called England is, of course, again, because it was Angland or Angland, like the land of the Angles, right? But in Old English, there was a letter that was an A and an E on one side, right? And eventually they just dropped the A, and that, of course, leads to England, right? So the big thing about it, though, he has three massive effects. He's going to help unify all these people. He's going to oust most of the Danes, and he's going to grow this concept of one unified kingdom under Anglo-Saxon culture, right? The other thing about it, though, is the Danes are going to get kicked out. And another big thing about Alfred the Great as well is he actually leads to this thing known as a growth in, literacy. He actually believed that learned people will grow much, much better, or will grow a country much, much better than unlearned people, right? So he actually encourages the growth of literacy and the growth of literature itself. He also created these things called the burhs, where literally there were these big fortified fortresses that actually prevent from any future Danish invasion, right? Alfred's descendants, though, are going to oust the Danes completely eventually and unite England under one crown. I think it was Ethelred that actually does it very first, right? Now, but then Alfred's great-great-great-grandson, after Alfred's long dead, right? So, Alfred, creates the concept of England, right? He was, unifying all these people under one bannerment, right? Well, he dies, and then his, later descendants actually do what he set out to do and creates the Kingdom of England, right? But then Alfred's great-great-great-grandson dies with absolutely no heirs, right? This guy, particularly speaking, his name was Edward, right? And Edward, Alfred's great-great-great-grandson, actually is a really interesting figure because he was super pious, right? He was very Christian, super, super Christian, loved his faith, loved the concept of praying, loved going to mass, loved doing all these different reconciliation things. And he did get married, but he never had any kids. But the fact of the matter is this Edward actually is now a saint in the Catholic Church, and you've heard of him before. His name is Saint Edward the Confessor, right? So the Confessor, as in that's how pious he was, right? The school in the area is actually named after him and stuff like that. But Edward actually, y'all, died with no kids. And so we have what's known as a succession crisis, right? A succession crisis. By the way, you have a crisis coming up for you pretty soon. That's right, you're going to have a quiz next class, right? You're going to have a quiz next class, and if you actually go to your study guide, you're going to see the 14, 15 people that I'm going to highlight in red that are going to be on your quiz. We're going to do a Middle Ages people mashing quiz, right? Very, very simple. You just study those names on that study guide that are highlighted in red, and you will be just fine for this quiz, okay? About 14 or 15 of them, right? Now, looking at this thing as well, what is a succession crisis, right? A succession crisis is when we don't know who's going to take over when a king actually dies. And a lot of times, multiple people will claim the throne, and it leads to a war, right? And in this particular thing, if you're talking about it in a lot of other classes, they'll be like, and 2 people claimed the throne, leading to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Well, actually, in real life, 3 people claimed the throne, actually, in all actuality, okay? So the 3 people that end up going after and claiming the throne are individuals known as Harold Godwinson, right, who was actually a very, very close family relative and the son of one of Edward's advisors, right, Edward the Confessor's advisors. And he actually, funny enough, was crowned king. Like in early 1066, right around, like I think it was like January 1066, he actually gets crowned king, and he does become Harold II for like a hot second, okay? And look at this terrible like drawing of him. We'll talk about why this thing's so ugly here in about 2 seconds. The other guy that actually ends up claiming the throne is a man by the name of William of Normandy, who also has a very ugly drawing of him. Huh, fun, fancy that. All right, so now big thing about William of Normandy, though, is he claims that one of Edward's archbishops actually said to him that Edward wanted him to be king after he died, and that he was going to choose him as his successor. So William of Normandy's pretty upset, and he decides that he wants to go and invade England and take the throne that he thinks that he therefore deserves, right? By the way, Normandy is in France. Like, that's right, we got a French guy that's like claiming the kingdom of England. It's a little bit of a bold move, Edward. Or not Edward, but a little bit of a bold move, William. All right, so now, and then we have Harold Hardrada, who is the king of Norway, who decides he's going to attack at one point and try to take over England by force. But he's lame, and nobody really cares about him, and he's not going to be on your test, because literally, he's kind of irrelevant, and he ends up dying pretty quickly anyway. Now, the thing about these two, ugly, drawings that look like they're made out of embroidered material, is because, y'all, I kid you not, this is the best source that we have about this thing known as the Battle of Hastings, okay? It's this item called the Bayeux Tapestry. It's a 224-foot long piece of fabric that actually talks about these 3 guys trying to claim the thrones for themselves. And as you can see, it's a borderline picture book that actually explains to us the battle, what happened, and what went down in a big, large field outside of Hastings, England in 1066. It's known as the Battle of Hastings, right? The Battle of Hastings was a very, very massive battle between the 3 claimants of the throne of the Anglo-Saxons, all right? Later known as England, all right? Going into it, though, Harold, unfortunately, cannot fight both of these armies. Harold Godwinson, the first guy that I actually told you about, who was actually crowned king, tries to fight off both of them. And if we look at this map real quick, he actually traveled all the way up to the north to fight off Hardrada, and Harold Hardrada, actually the other guy that's irrelevant, nobody cares about, got shot in the windpipe with an arrow and ends up dying, right? But then, now Harold's army, who has just defended themselves against the armies of Norway, has to march all the way back down, and outside of the town of Hastings, has to go off and fight William of Normandy. Well, the problem is, though, he's not going to win, because literally he defeats Hardrada, who of course Hardrada dies in battle, but then Harold himself dies in battle when he goes off to fight William of Normandy. That says Normandy. And also, fun fact, Harold Godwinson, this image, that's an arrow right there. Apparently it pierced his eye and went into his brain, and he died and flopped around on his horse until he actually loses the battle, okay? But that means that William is now going to be crowned king, and he becomes the king of England, right? So the thing about it is that he gets crowned a few months later on Christmas Day. There's a very, very fun little event that actually happens after the crowning of William of Normandy, and it actually is called the Burning of London, right? It actually is apparently a large coronation ceremony when they actually crowned William of Normandy. The peasants and the people that were there actually cheered for him, and they were like, yeah, our new king, William of Normandy, he's the bee's knees, we love this guy. Problem is that most of William of Normandy's soldiers couldn't speak English because they're all from France, right? So they thought that they were about to attack, so they actually decided to burn down most of the city of London, right? That's kind of messed up. You shouldn't do that. But it's an interesting little thing that shows us a demonstration about what's going to go on and the effects of William the Conqueror, right? Because big thing about it is they couldn't speak English, right? William couldn't speak very good English. He spoke French. And the English people spoke English. And they had to learn how to speak French, right? So what's going to happen, though, is the 2 languages will merge together and create the modern-day English English language, right? The English people will learn to speak French to talk to him. He will try to learn English to speak to them. And we have now this funky little language that has a lot of French elements and Latin elements inside of it, right? And also, William of Normandy stops being known as William of Normandy, and he eventually is known as William the Conqueror, right? And also, the big thing about it, he's going to create new nobles, and he's going to solidify the feudal and manorial system. He's going to create a new castle system that is actually much more fortified and can defend itself from any future Viking attack because it actually has walls and moats and these things called the Old Baileys. And the other big thing about it that is most important about him is he connects France and England pretty much in perpetuity for the next several hundred years. The crowns of France and England will kind of be like intertwined together. He also solidifies England as one large kingdom. The other big thing he has written is the Doomsday Book, right? But we'll talk about what the Doomsday Book is in class, and we'll actually add a little bit of stuff to that right after our quiz. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.